Mr Shorten, Andrew Probyn from the West Australian. Can I preface my question by observing that overnight Iceland beat England in the European Championship, and that in recent days even Lionel Messi misses penalties. But
just always remember, the favourite doesn't always get up.
Can I turn to July 2nd? Because by July 2nd, about 30% of Australian voters will have actually cast a pre-poll. Can you tell us how many, what you think that this will affect the, how this will affect the vote? What percentage you think will be people who are simply disaffected with you lot, and probably us lot as well? And whether in future elections, given that so many people choose to lodge a vote before election day, the pleasure should be granted to even more and make it a right and not a conditional right.
Well, I think there's two issues. Just going to the second part of your question, I like the idea that you have an election on a particular fixed day. Pre-polls available though, because people move around a lot. This is being held during school holidays in many jurisdictions. I believe in having an election on a particular day, but I like the flexibility that Australians are afforded with pre-poll. But I want to go to perhaps what I think is the deeper point of what you were saying. When you were saying, how will people vote and what effect will this have? What will affect this election are the choices which people make and the policies which we offer people. What will affect this election is whether Australians make a choice based upon our priorities of Medicare, jobs and education, or whether or not they think that a $50 billion tax cut by Mr Turnbull to large companies is the way this country should go. I feel very positive that when you outline our positive view of the future, our trust we've shown in the Australian people by putting our policies out there, that we will be rewarded well and positively by the Australian people because our policies go to the lives that people are living. Australians aren't waiting for government to tell them what to do. They're investing in the future. They're trying to keep fit and healthy. They want to make sure their kids get the best quality education. They have enough money set aside for retirement. They have interests outside of work. They don't let work define them. But what they want is a government who's in sync with the future that they seek for themselves. They want a government who's committed to working with the rise of Asia, and we've got policies for that. They want a government who's dealing with climate change and not deferring the problem. They want a government who will prioritise the health care of all Australians. They want a government who's going to help provide their kids with skills. They want a government who will help retrain older workers and not have them forgotten. Andrew, I think we've got a pretty good proposition. And I'm looking forward intensely to the next 4.5 days that remain in this election.
Next question is from Lenore Taylor, and can I offer the club's congratulations on becoming the editor of Guardian Australia?
Thank you very much. Mr Shorten, my question is about public hospitals. Labor's running ads right now attacking the coalition for cutting $80 billion from schools and hospitals, and we know that $57 billion of that figure was the cuts to projected future funding for hospitals. But 2 weeks ago you revealed that you were only putting $2 billion on top of Malcolm Turnbull's $2.9 billion in extra funding. My question is this: do you think public hospitals will require extra federal funding after those first 3 years? Because the states obviously do, even if it's not quite $57 billion, they're saying that they will need extra federal funds. If your answer is yes, why did you not put aside even a contingency amount in your 10-year costings? If the answer is no, why are you still using the $80 billion figure in your ads?
Thank you for that. And hospitals are a most important issue in this election. And in my address to you earlier, I said that this election is about choices. We've chosen to fund hospitals more generously and more significantly than Malcolm Turnbull. It's a choice. One thing I've learned and been reminded of as I've travelled hospital wards during this election, it's again my own experience as a parent. When you have a child, and it's not the be-all and end-all experience, but it's a pretty cathartic event when it happens, you realise that beyond your own existence, you've got these wonderful little people who are totally vulnerable and dependent upon you. And there is nothing more helpless for a parent than when they can't make their child well immediately, or when the cough persists, or there's something not happening, or they've had a fall, and then you've got to take them to a hospital. And again, I've been reminded during this campaign how important our hospitals are and why they should be properly funded. I'm terribly proud. You said we're offering to fund them $2 billion more than the Liberals. I have to say that is not an insignificant amount. And for me, when I think about that number, what I think about is reducing waiting times in emergency wards. I think about making sure we take some of the burden off our nurses and doctors, making sure that we fulfil that trust with parents who are also taxpayers. Now, we proposed a series of reforms to our healthcare system over the next 10 years. We will unfreeze the GP rebate. I frankly find it remarkable when Malcolm Turnbull, of all the front, can get up and say he's guaranteeing Medicare when he's freezing the GP rebate for 6 years. It is a manifest lie he tells on television every night. And then I look at the other things we're doing. We have decided to scrap the price hike for prescription medicine. It's just a values decision. We've decided to scrap the tax cut for large multinationals, and we've decided instead to use some of that money to scrap the price hike in medicine. It's just who we are in Labor. We prioritise the health care of Australians. If we get to the hospital reform package, we will deliver 50% of the efficient price for state-funded hospitals. That's what we will do. I'm confident in the next 4 years our reforms will deliver benefits. The previous 4-year health agreement, which was designed by Labor and government, has achieved reforms. The states sign up to 4-year agreements. All political parties have adopted the same funding proposition we have of 4-year models. But it is certainly true that the government revealed in their 2014 budget, and they spent 2 years denying it, that they were cutting the future projections in terms of health care. What Labor's done is made hard decisions. We've scraped together and found the scarce taxpayer dollars to unfreeze the GP rebate, to protect the bulk billing incentive for diagnostic imaging and pathology, for making sure that we don't go ahead with a price hike for medicines, and at the same time increasing our hospital funding package, which will decrease elective surgery waiting times. I've got no doubt that as we sit down, and if a Labor government's formed after July the 2nd, we will sit down and work with our states to make sure these agreements are effective, and at the end of the 4-year period we'll be in a much better position to forecast what is required for the healthcare for the years thereafter.
The question is, though, you're putting up a proposition in advertising that you're not prepared to live up to yourself. Are you going to put $57 billion up, or aren't you? And if you aren't, why are you running those ads?
I understood the question the first time. Well, no, but I just did, but I'll go through it again very briefly. We're providing 4-year costings in hospitals like the other parties, like the states do. But it is true that Mr Turnbull and his budgets have cut hospital funding. They published it in their 2014 budget. They have made those cuts. And we would love to be in a position to restore every dollar of funding. But it is not wrong to point out what the Liberals have cut, because they have. And we fought for 2 years against a barrage of Conservative propaganda which said those cuts weren't there. Now, I think everyone acknowledges those cuts are there. And what we're doing is making space in a tough budget, prioritising health care. We're putting back $12.5 billion in GP rebate freeze, $12.2 billion. We're putting up something like $2.9 billion in terms of the diagnostic imaging and bulk billing cuts. We're putting up $3.6 billion when it comes to the PBS price freeze. And we are putting, as you said, double the amount of hospital funding that Mr Turnbull's prepared to do in the first 4 years of a 4-year agreement.
AAP.
Paul Osborne from AAP. Thank you very much for your speech, Mr Shorten. I'd like to turn your attention to trade. You mentioned in your speech about bad free trade agreements. Australia is currently negotiating 7 free trade agreements, including the Gulf, India, Indonesia and a couple of others. Just wondering, which of these free trade agreements that's currently under negotiation would your government want to land as a priority in the next 3 years? And what does make a good free trade agreement?
We're very committed to free trade agreements. We did them in government and we've supported them in opposition. But what I did say in my speech, and it goes towards this context about the lessons of Brexit. The lessons for Brexit is that a divided government cannot deliver economic certainty. The other lesson of Brexit is that where you have a significant proportion of the population feeling left out, feeling forgotten by change, unable to see the benefits of change, to experiencing unemployment and cynicism, then you get the sort of division. I've spent my whole life being a moderate union rep, moderate in the Labor Party, moderate in terms of the Australian political spectrum. I fundamentally repudiate Malcolm Turnbull's economic approach at this election. He said he was going to move into the centre ground, but he didn't. Instead, his formula seems to have reduced for the time being to tax cuts for high net worth individuals and tax cuts for large companies. That is his economic story, which he's willing to expend billions of dollars. I understand your point about trade, but this is an important point about how you win a trade. Paul, I understand your question.
Trade deal.
I do, but I'm trying to put to you, you said what makes a good or a bad trade agreement. What makes a good trade agreement is one which the community support. And if you don't have community support for trade agreements, if they're bad trade agreements, if people think that somehow there's rorts in the visa system, if people think that somehow criminal syndicates have taken control of the allocation of visas, you undermine the credibility of all of our international engagement. And that's why I was making the point, Paul, that I am a moderate. I understand this country works best from trade to every other economic proposition when you're in the middle ground. So my answer on trade agreements is that if it benefits the mass of Australians and not the few, if it lifts living standards rather than see some people miss out, that is what I believe about trade, and that's what I believe about this country, Paul. I don't buy the argument that if the very few do very well, that somehow that justifies the very many doing very badly.
Seven Network.
Mark Riley from the Seven Network. Mr Shorten, I ask you about your superannuation policy because I don't know what it is at the moment, and I'm sure a lot of Australians don't. In the recent days, you've announced that you will match the government's savings on the cap, the $500,000 cap on after-tax contributions, and that's about $500 million, a fair whack of money over the forward estimates, but you've not said how you're going to raise that money, where those taxes will increase. Haven't people got an absolute right to know what your policy is before they cast their ballot on Saturday? So where will you raise that money?
Well, first of all, Mark, the problem with superannuation is that the government threw everything into the air and cast great confusion by their unconsulted, unwarned, in my opinion, not terribly well thought out measures they announced on budget night. Now, what we've said about our policies, and we said a fair while ago, is that superannuation tax concessions at the top end are simply not sustainable. We made that statement well over a year ago. My economic team and I have been talking with the superannuation industry, with planners, with retirees, with superannuation funds. And what we've done is we've got several measures, and they're all spelled out, but I'm happy to spell them out clearly now. One is that we are supporting, for low-income earners, that they get the tax they pay on their superannuation for people who earn up to $37,000, that they shouldn't have to pay tax on that, it should be credited to their superannuation. We are supporting that for low-income earners. On the top end of concessions, we've said that when Mr Howard and Mr Costello introduced their changes in the 2006-7 budget, we said that those changes are simply not sustainable anymore, and at the very top end, where you've got people with millions and millions of dollars in superannuation, it's not sustainable to run an argument which says that they should have all of that income tax-free in perpetuity when other people go to work and their income's taxed at much higher rates. Now, the issue most recently has been dealing with Mr Turnbull's changes. We've made no additional announcements in terms of any other policies. But what Mr Turnbull's done is he's raised the prospect of retrospectivity for some of the changes. The measures which aren't retrospective, I'm sure we can work through if we form a government. The retrospective measures, though, do have a cloud over them. I think that's fair to say that. There are some experts who've declared them to be retrospective. We've said we're gravely concerned about the prospect of retrospectivity. Now, Mr Turnbull has asserted to all and sundry there is no retrospectivity. What we will do, and the best place you can do that is from government, we'll sit down with independent experts and we'll satisfy ourselves as to the extent which these measures are not retrospective or if any of them are retrospective. But we can only do that from government. And if Mr Turnbull says that his measures are not retrospective, then if they turn out to be retrospective, how can he bank the saves from that, unless he intends just to make retrospective changes?
Why can't you consult an opposition?
Well, the truth of the matter is that Malcolm Turnbull brought that budget down on May the 3rd, and then ever since then we've been in a perpetual election campaign. The government's been at 6s and 7s to explain their transition to retirement proposals. They've been at 6s and 7s to explain to people how you calculate your tax records back 10 years. It's an open secret in industry and in the Australian Tax Office that they're being overwhelmed by questions by people, by retirees, self-funded retirees, by people who put non-concessional contributions beyond $500,000 into their accounts. The tax office has been overwhelmed. They've now got to the point where, anecdotally, they're just leaving the messages and inquiries on voicemail. This government doesn't know how to implement these changes. It is not clear if the changes are actually implementable. What we will do from government, because the changes aren't fully due to come until the 1st of July 2017, is we'll sit down and do what this government hasn't done. We will talk to people. But I want to make it very clear. I do not support the proposition that you make retrospective tax laws in this country. This government says they're not retrospective. I think that the mess that this government's thrown the whole superannuation system into can be best resolved when Labor forms a government and we talk to people.
Australian Financial Review.
The Financial Review. I'm Laura Tingle. Mr Shorten, in your speech you say that keeping our promises and offering certainty over the next term depends on a capacity to negotiate with the Parliament. So my question is, on the 100% certainty that whoever wins government, there will be more budget savings announced in the next Parliament, should the fact that savings have not been mentioned in the campaign immediately disqualify them, or should both the House and the Senate make the quality and equity of budget measures the guiding principle for considering the policy?
No, our intention is to stick to the promises we've made before an election. That's why we've gone to such lengths to outline our policies. I mean, the government's only today been dragged kicking and screaming to release costings. I don't know if they've done that yet today. But it's a sort of unusual world where the opposition puts its costings out ahead of the government. It's an unusual world where the opposition's put forward policies and rolled them out for the last year. But one of the reasons why we've done this is we do not intend to be a big spending government. We intend to implement the platform which we have outlined before the election. We don't want to start making capricious changes once in government. That really frustrates people. We've chosen to be so upfront with the Australian people because we have a platform for social and economic improvement in Australia. The measures which we announced before the election will be the policies we carry in government.
What's the expectation about what Parliament should do about other measures?
Well, in terms of Parliament, we'll have to see what the Australian people provide in the way of who gets elected. But we will implement and debate our policies and our agenda. Now, I'm optimistic that our approach of not automatically saying that everything the Liberals say is wrong and bad, of our policy of not treating minor parties as being some sort of social or political inferiors, a respectful attitude to the Parliament. I want to make Parliament work. I don't think the Liberals do.
The Advertiser.
Jackson Gothsnow from the Adelaide Advertiser. Mr Shorten, thanks for the speech. Just looking at South Australia, how have Labor's actions or inactions contributed to the rise of Nick Xenophon there? And just quickly, I wanted to take you to what you call the defining moment of the campaign in your speech. Mr Turnbull saying what political parties say they will support and oppose at one time is not necessarily what they will do. That seems pretty obvious to me. Do you think that's factually incorrect?
So could you repeat the last bit of your question?
Just referring to your speech.
Yeah, that bit.
You've quoted Mr Turnbull saying what political parties say they will support and oppose at one time is not necessarily what they will do. This is what you've called the defining moment of the campaign. It seems like a pretty obvious statement to me, a pretty factually true statement to me. Do you think it's incorrect?
Well, in terms of Nick Xenophon, I guess one of the luxuries of being a free-range independent is you can be all things to all people because you never have to form a government. Must be a wonderful world going around just making up whatever you want to say to appeal to people. It's a great world, but it's just not the way to run a government. It's not the way to run the political process. There are only two parties who are seeking to form a government in this country, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. So I understand that Senator Xenophon can say good things to people whenever he feels like it in return for their votes. He's got that luxury that he'll never have to keep his promises. Only the Labor Party and the Liberal Party are seeking to form a government. That's why we have got a choice between the two major parties. Our choices are in favour of Medicare. Our choices are in favour of education. Our choices are not in favour of providing a $50 billion corporate tax cut, which won't work, which I'm not even sure Mr Turnbull will agree to sign up to now. In terms of what Mr Turnbull actually said, which really I think is a pretty big moment in this election, when he says that what political parties say they will support and oppose at one time is not necessarily what they will do. Well, I think that shows breathtaking cynicism about his whole election campaign. His campaign is essentially, I'm Malcolm, don't hold me to anything, you sort of know me, I've been around a fair bit, it's my time, it's my turn, it's my place. That's it. Is that really what this election is about? Someone who says, by the way, you know, what I say and do now, you shouldn't expect it to be what I say and do if I get elected. I don't hold that standard. The Labor Party accepts, and we've applied this discipline to our election policies. What we say is what we will do. We mean what we say. We've said what we mean all along. Mr Turnbull saying what political parties say they will support and oppose at one time is not necessarily what they will do. It may be a statement of fact about Mr Turnbull's political approach to life, but it's not the basis upon which he should be elected Prime Minister of this country.
News.com.au.
Malcolm Farr from news.com.au. Thanks for your address, Mr Shorten. Could I get an idea, please, of the boundaries you'd put around Medicare? Would a Labor government reject a genuine, valid proposal to outsource some of the mechanics of Medicare, even if that could lower the cost of the service, increase efficiency and increase its sustainability? If the answer is yes, wouldn't that be election posturing triumphing over common sense?
I know that there are some in the Australian political community who are a bit over Labor Party talking about defending Medicare, but the truth is that if we don't defend Medicare, no one will. You go to the payment system, which was the source of some debate. Let's call it as it really is. My opponent set up a privatisation task force. A privatisation task force, they allocated $5 million towards it. As that man on the TV said, you don't set up a task force to privatise if you don't intend to do it. Now, I, for one, just simply don't believe Mr Turnbull when he makes a temporary tactical retreat and says, well, we won't do that, we'll disband that group. The fact of the matter is, look at the history of the Liberal Party, look at their actions. Malcolm Fraser said at the start of the Medicare debates that before an election, oh, we won't disband it. Then as soon as he got elected, he did. John Howard and Tony Abbott have also said they won't undermine healthcare, they won't make cuts, they won't affect Medicare. Famously, though, when they get elected, they did. I just don't believe Malcolm Turnbull. I think he said it because we forced a retreat on him. Now, of course, when you look at the efficiency of the system, Labor's always up for improving the system. But I believe that the payment system is a fundamental part of the Medicare architecture. I'm not interested in seeing it outsourced. But having said that, I also believe that Medicare funding isn't guaranteed anyway. Mr Turnbull's making ads on television and he walks along to the parliamentary offices and he says, Medicare funding's guaranteed. Well, how can you stand there in front of the Australian people and tell lies like that? Medicare funding is not guaranteed. If you get a freeze on the GP rebates for 6 years, a third of doctors, according to the Royal College of GPs, will have to stop bulk billing. If you are increasing the price of medicine, you are making it harder to have universal medical health care. If you are getting rid of the bulk billing incentives for x-rays, for blood tests, you are making it harder for people to access universal, affordable health care. We will not be deterred from the fight to defend Medicare merely because Mr Turnbull's made a tactical short-term retreat on one issue. And in fact, if anything, if Mr Turnbull really wanted to guarantee Medicare, this is what he should do. Unfreeze the rebate, don't go ahead with a price hike for medicine, reinstate the bulk billing incentive, and he can afford to do that by not going ahead with an astounding and astonishing $50 billion tax cut for large companies which this nation cannot afford and should not be paid for from the budget of the health care of Australians.
The Conversation.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Mr Shorten, you say you will keep all your promises, which is obviously an important reassurance to voters. But I do recall that Bob Hawke, when he was opposition leader in this room at this stage of the campaign, put a caveat on his undertaking to keep promises, saying that if he found things were different, then he felt that that justified not keeping every promise. Are you going to give yourself no abundant caution let out from what is a fairly sweeping commitment that you've made?
Well, first of all, Michelle, it's a sign of Australian politics that people don't even expect the politicians to keep the promises they made. I mean, I'm just reflecting on an earlier question about what Mr Turnbull said, and the question was, well, isn't he just being factual? For Malcolm Turnbull to say in an election what political parties say they will support and oppose at one time is not necessarily what they will do. Maybe a statement of truth about the Liberal Party, but the Labor Party, we cannot govern ourselves by those low standards. I mean, at least Hawke put a caveat. Malcolm Turnbull hasn't even bothered with the caveat. He hasn't even bothered with the promise. He's outsourced the middle part of the promise and just gone, well, just wait and see what happens after the election. For myself, the reason why I'm confident we can keep our promises is because we haven't gone in our budget to rely upon zombie measures which will never pass the Senate, because we haven't taken the low road of smashing family budgets. The Liberals are in great glee over a minor difference in terms of the first 4 years relatively of a $400 billion budget, $1.6 trillion over the next 4 years. But the problem with their approach is that they will make savage cuts, which will harm the fabric of this community. The problem with their approach is that they are camouflaging cuts which will never get through a Senate. Now, we've eschewed that sort of approach of smashing the family budget, and the reason why I'm confident we can keep our promises because we're making long-term structural reform. Not for us, the faint heart of saying that the property industry will always maintain negative gearing in perpetuity. Not for us, the easy road to simply say, well, let's just give corporate tax cuts away and fingers crossed hope that some of that money eventually trickles through to the economy. We have made the decision to clamp down on dodgy private providers in the vet sector. We have made the decision to call out Tony Abbott's climate policy, which is Malcolm Turnbull's climate policy, paying big polluters for little appreciable results. And we have made the decision that we don't need to spend $160 million on a plebiscite for a non-binding opinion poll so that some people's relationships have to go the gamut of public opinion. We've made policies which are winding back unsustainable tax concessions. We've led the debate on making multinationals pay their fair share. The other thing is that, and I think this OECD report, which was released recently, I think really does get to the heart of some of the matters about our economic propositions compared to Mr Turnbull's corporate tax cuts, big end of town winners. What they said and what we support is if you invest in education and you invest in public infrastructure, that's the sustainable basis for economic growth. That's why I'm confident we can keep our promises, because our promises are funded. Our promises will deliver each year a better position.
The election campaign is almost over. So have you checked how your views compare to the parties? Go online to Vote Compass before time runs out. Answer a few quick questions to know where you really stand on the political spectrum. Go to abc.net.au/votecompass. You might be surprised.
After Orlando,
just that feeling of here we go again.
The mother who's turned personal tragedy into a quest for real gun reform.
I think we're better than this. How many of us do we have to be before we're heard?
Foreign Correspondent, tonight 9:30 on ABC and iView. The Queen has turned 90. Sunday, an intimate portrait of this remarkable monarch.
She's such a timeless figure.
Hats off to her, it's incredible.
Filmed with unprecedented access.
We have the #1 leader.
See the Queen through the eyes of those who know her best, her family.
I feel she's been there as sort of a gentle guidance really for me.
The Queen at 90.
She inspires me every day.
She put up with all of us. It's quite an achievement, I think.
Sunday at 8 on ABC and iView.